It's the early morning of February 24th, 2022. The soldiers of the Ukrainian 137th Separate Marine Battalion, responsible for guarding multiple checkpoints connecting the occupied Crimean Peninsula to mainland Ukraine, start hearing the movement of large Russian columns. Around 4 am, Russian forces begin an intensive shelling of Ukrainian positions, confirming that the full-scale invasion in the southern Ukraine has begun. Ivan Sesrivatovsky, one of the Marines, follows instructions and attempts to detonate the explosives wired on the key bridges. However, no explosions occur. After multiple attempts, the soldiers who guard the border begin a hurried retreat as Russian forces advance past checkpoints. To the northeast, another bridge is at risk of being taken. After a similar failure to trigger the explosives, the sapper of the 137th Separate Marine Battalion, Vitaly Skakun, volunteers to manually fix the issue. He completes the task, but with Russian forces already closing in, there is no time for a safe withdrawal. Sapper reports that the bridge is successfully mined and immediately detonates it. Vitaly Skakun will be posthumously awarded the title of Hero of Ukraine, becoming one of the first, if not the very first, Ukrainian soldier killed in the course of the full-scale Russian invasion. Coming back to the initial disposition of forces, prior to the invasion, the Russian grouping in the Crimea consists of 49th and 58th Combined Arms Armies, reinforced by the local 22nd Army Corps and the 20th Motor Rifle Division. Additionally, the land invasion is supposed to be complemented by air and amphibious assaults behind Ukrainian lines. For this, Russians plan to use, first and foremost, 14 large landing ships and other vessels of the Black Sea Fleet in the Crimea. We will only tangentially talk about the naval component here, as we made a detailed breakdown of the war on the sea in a separate video. It's worth adding, however, that the 336th and 810th Marine Brigades, as well as 177th Separate Guards Marine Regiment, are the main units that are supposed to perform landings. With Crimea, often called unsinkable aircraft carrier, hosting multiple airfields with over 100 fixed-wing aircraft and 50 helicopters, it makes sense that Russians also plan a number of helicopter landings with forces of the 7th Guards Mountain Air Assault Division and the 11th Separate Air Assault Brigade, as well as a few Spetsnaz units. The Russian invasion force, totaling somewhere between 20 and 25,000 men, with over 1,000 various pieces of equipment, will attack just around 1,500 Ukrainian troops to the south of the Dnieper River. Out of those, no more than 400 soldiers positioned directly along the Crimean border, mainly the 137th Separate Marine Battalion of the 35th Marine Brigade and the 25th Border Guards Detachment. Their available equipment includes only small arms, a single BTR, and a SPG-9 recoilless rifle with 6 rounds. Further back, elements of the 131st Reconnaissance Battalion are stationed in Odradivka, while the 59th Motorized Infantry Brigade is deployed on training grounds near Oleshki. Deputy Commander of the Operational Command South, Major General Andrei Sokolov, estimated that at least 4 full brigades would be necessary to counter a potential attack. However, no reinforcements were available due to the broader Russian offensive across multiple fronts. Ukrainian military planners also anticipated that Russia would escalate the conflict in Donbass rather than launch a large-scale invasion from Crimea, so they prioritized manning east, not south, which turned out to be a significant blunder. Additionally, the role of the Russian intelligence operations in the region should not be underestimated. The risk posed by an attack from Crimea may have been easily downplayed by figures such as Oleg Kulinich, the head of the Security Service of Ukraine's Directorate for Crimea. Shortly after the invasion began, Kulinich was arrested for treason, having been identified as an agent of Russian Federal Security Service. Another suspect, Igor Sadokhin, head of the another Security Service department, was arrested for passing information about Ukrainian minefields locations in the border to the Russian forces. His ties to the both former and current governors of Kherson region suggest that Russia had likely established a vast network of agents to assist the invasion. This aspect of hybrid warfare requires further examination, but it is evident that Russia's intelligence network in Kherson and Zaporizhia played a key role in supporting the initial advance. On February 23rd, Andrei Sokolov receives an order to reposition the 59th Motorized Infantry Brigade closer to Crimea. The 9th Motorized Infantry Battalion is sent to guard the road to Melitopol, while the rest of the brigade begins redeployment from training grounds in Oleshki to the Chaplinka area. On February 24th, as the invasion begins, Ukrainian forces are still in transit, with their progress hampered by heavy opening bombardments and missile strikes from Russian aviation and the Black Sea Fleet. At the same time, meeting minimal resistance, Russian columns break through all three key checkpoints between Crimea and mainland Ukraine. Only the bridge in Henichynsk is heavily damaged due to the sacrifice of Vitaly Skakun, so Russian advance is hampered there. Ukrainian plans to demolish other crossings were disrupted, likely due to preliminary shelling that damaged wires or infiltration of saboteurs that deactivated explosives. Another possibility is that devices simply malfunctioned or were not properly installed. After all, due to bureaucracy, the explosives had to be placed by combat engineers rather than the Marines and border guards stationed at the bridges, making it hard to service and check them regularly. Whatever was the reason why the majority of bridges were not blown up, the lack of defenders in the region was a much greater issue. After all, Crimea was also connected to mainland Ukraine by regular roads, which would be used by enemy columns even if no intact bridges exist. Russian opening missile strikes in the southern Ukraine disabled several key air defense systems around Melitopol, Novakhovka and Kherson, giving Russia local air superiority. At the same time, Ukrainians succeeded in evacuating their aviation before the strikes to the backup airfields. The 299th Tactical Aviation Brigade, based on Kulbakina airfield, suffers no losses on the ground except a few retired airframes, immediately putting its Su-25 attack aircraft into action after evading initial strikes. The 10th Naval Aviation Brigade, which specializes in rescue missions but also has deadly Bayraktar TB2 drones in its disposal, was also safely relocated before the attack. Finally, Ukrainian 11th Army Aviation Brigade, based in Kherson Airport, also disperses and gets into action as it operates Mi-8s and Mi-24 attack helicopters, which are much more flexible in terms of landing locations than planes. On the ground, the 137th Marine Battalion, following instructions, retreats from the border along with border guards. Some elements, including conscripts, engaged Russian forces and managed to at least damage a few vehicles, but are overpowered by artillery and tank fire. After suffering significant losses, including their only BTR, survivors either withdraw or are captured. They lack the manpower and equipment to resist the overwhelming Russian force, advancing with thousands of troops and hundreds of vehicles. As in the other parts of Ukraine, Russian forces use key highways to advance rapidly and secure strategic locations. In southern Ukraine, their priority is capturing Oleshki and Novakhovka, which have critical crossings over the Dnieper River. Melitopol, a major transportation hub, is also a key target. Russian troops cross the intact bridge near Chonhar with 19th Motor Rifle Division and Marine units, while the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade conducts an amphibious landing behind Ukrainian lines. This landing, involving around 2,000 troops and over 30 APCs, was likely meant for Mariupol, but was redirected due to mined waters. However, the Marines received inadequate instructions, leaving them disoriented and moving aimlessly through villages. Meanwhile, the limited number of intact bridges slows down the Russian advance. Such delay, possible due to sacrifice of Vitaly Skakun, allows Ukrainians to bring the 9th Motorized Infantry Battalion of the 59th Brigade to Rykove, as well as evacuate at least 5 Il-76 military transports and 6 Su-25 attack aircraft from the Melitopol airfield, which serves as a base of the Ukrainian 25th Transport Aviation Brigade. Only one of the Il-76s was hit by a missile that killed technicians and crew members, destroying a plane that was ready to take off. With the base empty, the local 115th Territorial Defense Battalion uses it to arm themselves and begin the defense of Melitopol with the 137th Marine Battalion, which retreated through Henichynsk. In Kherson, hundreds of civilians volunteer to join territorial defense forces. However, on the first day, most city officials, police and security service of Ukrainian personnel leave, making it difficult to organize the volunteers effectively. Despite that, due to the determination of locals who demand to be armed for city defense, the enlistment officers start organizing volunteers, sending them to Nadnepransk. Many members of the 124th Territorial Defense Brigade view the situation as sabotage, as elsewhere in Ukraine, territorial defense forces are assembled inside major cities to maintain order and support regular military units. However, in Kherson, they are sent to remote villages, while the main weapons for over 500 volunteers are stored far away in Antonivka and Sodove. This mismanagement raises concerns about whether local authorities were simply incompetent or deliberately aiding the Russian advance. Nevertheless, Igor Likhnov, commander of the 192nd Battalion of the 124th Territorial Defense Brigade, forms 3 companies into a functioning fighting force. Meanwhile, Russian forces reach Kudryava and Brylivka within hours. The 59th Motorized Brigade also arrives in the area and engages in first battles. Ukrainian forces had to enter the skirmishes right after the march, so without prepared defensive positions and against superior forces, they are routed with heavy losses. Ukrainian Su-25s of the 299th Tactical Aviation Brigade provide close air support in the area, destroying multiple Russian columns but losing aircraft with tail number Blu-19, piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Shebrov, who did not survive. Nearby, Captain Alexander Sherbakov directs his Su-25 right into the Russian column after being hit. The geography of the Kherson region plays a significant role in the battle. Unlike other parts of Ukraine, it consists mainly of open and flat fields, with a very few rivers or forested areas. It is sparsely populated farmlands, with no existing fortifications or big cities up until the river. Even blocking the key roads or mining them would have a little effect, as Russian vehicles are not restricted by difficult terrain like forests, hills or swamps. This is yet another reason why Russian advance in this region is significantly faster and largely unopposed compared to other areas of Ukraine. Despite an increasingly dire situation, under relentless assaults from Russian aviation, the 59th Motorized Brigade stretches itself thin, but continues to resist along key roads. Their actions inflict the first losses on the Russians, and buy precious time for the rest of the forces on the right bank of the Dnieper River. The brigade's tank company, under the command of the 23-year-old Yevhen Pachenko, successfully blocks bridges across one of the few wide canals near Serhiivka as Russian forces reach the outskirts of Nova Kakhovka. However, the situation worsens when Russian paratroopers deploy by helicopters in the area of Nova Kakhovka Dam. Realizing that they can no longer hold back the advancing 7th Mountain Air Assault Division and auxiliary forces, Ukrainians in this sector retreat across the smaller dam to the right bank of the canal and move westward. At 11:30 am, just as the 59th Brigade stabilizes its flank, they receive a shocking news. Russian troops numbering over 100 men of the 11th Air Assault Brigade have landed right near the Antonivka Road bridge, effectively capturing the last available river crossing. They establish a foothold in Antonivka, while the columns of the 20th Motor Rifle Division use the ensuing chaos to push towards the bridge. Russian paratroopers begin to ambush the forces of the 59th Brigade, mainly artillery that withdraws to the right bank due to the rapid Russian advance. At one point, on the key road, Ukrainians and Russian military trucks even pass each other without engaging, yet another sign that the Russian advance is not that well coordinated, but is succeeding due to the sheer lack of Ukrainian forces in the region. Despite that, the 59th Brigade remains squeezed between the wide river and thousands of Russian troops rapidly advancing from all sides. Recognizing that the situation is beyond critical, the Ukrainian command orders the tank company to pull back from Serhiivka and head toward the bridge. Meanwhile, a lightly armed company from the 124th Territorial Defense Brigade, mostly volunteers who had just retrieved small arms from Sadove, arrive at the scene only to be hit by an airstrike. Despite that, 2 more companies of territorial defense arrive from Dniepryansk, while Pachenko's tank company also starts engaging Russians around 4:30 p.m. By 8 p.m., after a brutal fight, the combined efforts of volunteers and tanks of the 59th Motorized Infantry Brigade eliminate most of the Russian paratroopers. However, understanding that the enemy will likely attempt another assault on the bridge to cut them off completely, the Ukrainian command makes the decision to withdraw from the left bank. Under the cover of the newly arrived battalion of the 80th Air Assault Brigade, the 59th Brigade forms columns and begins withdrawal from the left bank. As Russian artillery moves closer, many vehicles, mostly supply trucks, are destroyed on the road to the bridge or simply abandoned. Many civilian vehicles also try to evacuate from occupied areas to the right bank, so withdrawal is slow, which allows Russians to continue attacks on retreating Ukrainian columns. In some cases, soldiers abandon trucks and equipment to avoid being stuck in traffic jams that start to form, so the withdrawal is hardly organized. Despite that, Ukrainian troops hold the vital corridor to allow the bulk of the 59th Motorized Infantry Brigade, numbering over 1,000 men and hundreds of pieces of equipment, to escape to fight another day. For his pivotal role in retaking the Antonivka Bridge and saving his brigade, Yevhen Pachenko is later awarded the title of Hero of Ukraine. Meanwhile, as Ukrainian forces concentrate around Antonivka, Russian troops managed to cross the Kakhovka Dam, likely due to previous air assault, continuing their push. This is a major setback for Ukrainians, who had counted on the river as a natural defensive barrier, but lacked manpower to hold both crossings against elite Russian divisions. Furthermore, with the 59th Brigade and other units trapped on the left bank, the Ukrainians were unable to destroy the key crossings, allowing Russian forces to maintain their momentum. On February 25th, the situation is no better for the defenders of Melitopol. Elements of the 137th Marine Battalion and the 9th Battalion of the 59th Brigade, commanded by Serhiy Kotenko, reinforced by the local 115th Territorial Defense Battalion, struggled to hold against the relentless assaults of the 19th and 42nd Motor Rifle Divisions, the 810th Marine Brigade, and 177th Separate Marine Regiment. Some counterattacks are attempted as mechanized and heavily armed elements of the 23rd National Guard Brigade arrive to reinforce the city, but after intense skirmishes, Ukrainian forces are ultimately forced to retreat. First to Tokmak, then as far as Kamiansk to avoid encirclement. This major defeat allows Russian forces to advance unimpeded through the Zaporizhia region, capturing hundreds of square kilometers and ultimately setting the stage for the encirclement and the Battle of Mariupol, which we covered in a separate video. At the same time, Major General Dmytro Marchenko rushes to Mykolaiv. A veteran of the war in Donbass and former serviceman of the 79th Air Assault Brigade, he had most recently served as a head of logistics and support for Ukrainian military before his retirement. When Marchenko arrives in Mykolaiv on February 25th, he finds the city in complete turmoil. News spreads quickly that nearby Kherson is on the verge of the falling, while the saboteurs and Russian reconnaissance units are spotted on the outskirts. Many regional officials either disappear or remain paralyzed by indecision. Without hesitation, Marchenko takes charge of Mykolaiv's defense. He quickly establishes communication between various territorial defense units, prevents the premature demolition of the Varvaryevsky Bridge, a vital supply route, and gathers intelligence on Russian movements in nearby villages from civilians. Elements of the 36th Marine and 79th Air Assault Brigades stationed in the city are placed on a high alert while makeshift fortifications begin appearing in Mykolaiv's streets. Meanwhile, another key figure emerges, Vitaly Kim, the governor of the Mykolaiv region. While Marchenko handles military operations, Kim delivers daily video updates to reassure the population, prevent panic, and ensure that the essential city services continue functioning. Under this unexpectedly effective makeshift leadership, Mykolaiv transforms into the critical stronghold, poised to disrupt Russia's rapid advance. Near Kherson, Ukrainian Operational Command South, led by Andriy Kovalchuk, reacts too slowly, allowing Russian paratroopers to outflank and overwhelm Ukrainian forces near the Antonivka Bridge. Despite destroying several Russian convoys with artillery and attempting unsuccessfully to demolish the Antonivka Road Bridge, elements of the 59th Motorized Infantry and 80th Air Assault Brigades are forced to retreat to Molodizhne. As Russian forces cross the Dnieper River, a lightly armed territorial defense battalion under Igor Lyukhnov withdraws from Daryevka Bridge to Kherson to avoid being cut off. Capitalizing on this, Russian troops push towards Molodizhne from two directions. The 59th Brigade's tanks and the 80th Air Assault Brigade's paratroopers engage in intense overnight battles, launching counterattacks despite dwindling numbers. Under relentless artillery and airstrikes, as well as continued Russian assaults, the Ukrainian forces are ultimately forced to retreat towards Mykolaiv after heavy losses. During the fighting, Yevhen Palchenko, the above-mentioned tank company commander of the 59th Motorized Infantry Brigade, loses his tank but miraculously survives. Ukrainian command likely anticipated that Russian forces would enter Kherson and become bogged down in the street battles against territorial defense units and remaining regular forces positioned at Chernobyevka airport. This would buy time for reinforcements from the 28th Mechanized and 35th Marine Brigades currently protecting Odessa from potential amphibious landings to intervene. However, the Russians bypass Kherson, advancing straight towards Mykolaiv. This unexpected maneuver further fragments Ukrainian forces and isolates Kherson defenders. Inside Mykolaiv, Russian troops attempt another airborne assault, deploying via helicopters behind Ukrainian lines. However, the sacrifices of the Ukrainian troops near Antonivka Bridge had provided crucial time for Mykolaiv's defenses to organize. When saboteurs appear in the city's port, police and territorial defense forces quickly neutralize them, capturing most. Meanwhile, Russian paratroopers also land near Koblovo, on the border of Kherson and Mykolaiv regions, but are met by soldiers of the 28th Mechanized Brigade, who engage them in fierce combat and wipe out the invading force. Elements of the brigade are then redeployed to Voznesensk, north of Mykolaiv, and inside the city as well. On February 26th, Russians continue their push, stretching across the Kherson region but securely holding both key river crossings. The Ukrainian Su-25s of the 299th Tactical Aviation Brigade continue the attacks on Russian columns far behind the enemy lines. Flying at extremely low altitudes, the attack aircraft devastated the whole columns using all available guided and unguided munitions. Even though the strikes are effective and still catch Russians off guard, which is evident by the fact that destroyed Russian equipment is not spread out, Ukrainians also start taking significant losses. Another Su-25, called sign Blue 49, is lost near Molodizhne while strafing Russian columns at Antonivka Bridge. The pilot, Senior Lieutenant Andrei Maximov, ejects successfully but is wounded, captured and later exchanged. Near Fedorivka, another Su-25, called sign Blue 31, is downed, as its pilot Andrei Antikhovich does not survive. These losses deal a severe blow to the Ukraine's already limited fleet of Su-25s, estimated at just 20 to 30 aircraft. However, with few effective alternatives to stop the Russian advance, Ukrainian aviation continues operating at full capacity. Surprisingly, Russian fighter jets almost do not engage Ukrainian aircraft directly, instead conducting their own quite successful strikes together with attack helicopters. During one such mission near Sakhi, Ukrainian forces shoot down a Russian Mi-35 attack helicopter. On the ground, Russian tanks reach the outskirts of Mykolaiv, briefly entering the city streets before pulling back to bypass road. Their presence, coupled with indiscriminate artillery shelling, causes momentary chaos. However, the Russians fail, or perhaps never intend, to seize any administrative buildings, leaving Mykolaiv firmly in Ukrainian hands. The city's defense relies primarily on the 123rd Territorial Defense Brigade, the Mykolaiv company of the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, comprising mostly of civilians just days prior, police units, and the 19th Public Order Protection Regiment of the National Guard. With the bulk of the 36th Marine and 79th Air Assault Brigades engaged in combat on the eastern front line, only about 100 soldiers from each unit remain at the city headquarters in Mykolaiv. Nonetheless, their presence proves instrumental in training thousands of civilian volunteers eager to defend the city. On February 27th, in Posad Pokrovska, partisans ambush a Russian column heading to Mykolaiv. Surprisingly, they capture one intact T-90A and two BMP-3s of the 20th Motor Rifle Division. Near the river crossing, in the area of Kakhovka Dam, the entire column of BMDs from the 7th Guards Mountain Air Assault Division is obliterated, either by Ukrainian artillery or aviation. In other words, as the shock from the first days of the war fades, Ukrainians start putting up more and more resistance, even while being completely outnumbered and outgunned. This, however, cannot be said about southern Zaporizhia region, where the 19th and 42nd Motor Rifle Divisions and the 136th Separate Guards Motor Rifle Brigade reach the outskirts of Tokmak and capture Berdyansk, respectively, by February 28th. While the civilians take to the streets to protest the occupation, partisans occasionally attack Russian vehicles, but without the support of regular army units, they are unable to stop the adversary's advance. As wrecked Ukrainian troops are forced to retreat from Chernobyevka, the Russian columns reach Zemivnik, completely encircling Kherson. The only forces inside the city are the local 192nd and 194th Territorial Defense Battalions, formed mostly from civilians, with a few veterans of war in Donbass. 10 paratroopers of the 80th Air Assault Brigade, who also end up inside the encircled Kherson, attempt to break through to friendly forces in Mykolaiv, but are all killed in action. Understanding that there is no way out, Kherson Territorial Defense Battalions, numbering somewhere between 500 and 600 men, brace for the assault, preparing light arms, grenades, few grenade launchers, and Molotov cocktails. March 1st marks the most tragic day for the city of Kherson. Ukrainians receive word that the Russians are about to begin the city assault, and Dmytro Ishchenko, commander of the 124th TDF Brigade, orders city defenders to set up positions at the city entrances. The first company of the 194th TDF Battalion goes to Belozerka Square, and the second goes to Naftovoy Street. In a similar manner, the rest of the forces spread out to protect the city perimeter. Russians pick Naftovoy Street for their advance, quickly reaching the local shopping mall area, behind which lies Buskovy Park. This is where the first company of the 194th TDF Battalion, numbering 43 men, and commanded by Dmitro Kuzmenko, head of the battalion, makes its stand. Some of the forces hide in the park, while the rest take positions near the buildings. However, Russians employ snipers from the top of the shopping mall to initially spot and engage the volunteers, so the battle rages before the main armored column approaches. This disrupts defenders' plans to use Molotov cocktails against Russian column advancing down the street towards the city center. Once the Russians locate the city defenders in the park, they use grenade launchers and mortars to pound them, injuring multiple soldiers. Only then do the Russian BTR and 2 BMPs approach from the shopping mall area and open fire with machine guns and autocannons. The defenders are quickly overwhelmed, but even under such circumstances, company commander Oleg Makarsky hits the Russian BMP with an RPG. However, the shot is unlucky and he only damages the vehicle. Soon he is killed. Another BMP that directly enters the park is damaged by Alexander Kozak. The Russian fire is so dense that it cuts down trees in the park, leaving no chance for the soldiers hiding behind them. The battle quickly turns into massacre, as the defenders cannot do much against Russian armored vehicles and are forced to retreat. The battle in Boskovy Park lasted just 20 minutes, taking the lives of at least 24 Ukrainian soldiers who were civilians just a week ago. The majority of other defenders of Boskovy Park are wounded, but some make it to the local hospital. These soldiers are saved by local doctors twice, first when they treat their wounds, and second when hospital staff fakes the diagnosis to full Russian soldiers who come to finish off the Kherson defenders in the hospital. The battle in Boskovy Park will go down in history as one of the most tragic and heroic moments of Kherson's defense. However, similar battles of volunteers against Russian armor occur all over the city on March 1st. Nevertheless, the remains of the Ukrainian territorial defense forces are unable to maintain control over the city, and the Russians, attacking from all sides, quickly suppress the resistance. The survivors of the brief but brutal combat, including the commander of the 124th Territorial Defense Brigade, Dmitro Ishchenko, as well as the commander of the 194th Battalion, Dmitro Kuzmenko, stay in the city to act as undercover resistance. Some Ukrainian soldiers leave the city to continue direct resistance by joining the defenders of Mykolaiv, which is the next Russian target. This is how in 5 days the first Ukrainian regional center is captured by Russians. Before establishing control over Kherson, the Russians also occupied Chernobyevka air base, often referred to as Kherson International Airport. This place will become quite famous a little later, but for now, the Russians just established their logistical hub there for further advance to Mykolaiv. The airport has an airfield, a large area, and no civilians, who could be members of the resistance, so the Russians quickly start stockpiling equipment there. The 126th Coastal Defense Brigade also advances along key roads to Yavkine, infiltrating as far as Bashtanka. After advancing unopposed for hundreds of kilometers, the Russians do not expect resistance and try to drive through the town's central street. The Ukrainian local 190th Territorial Defense Battalion and police let the head of the column pass, and then witness how Ukrainian Su-25s descend from the skies, destroying with rockets and bombs many Russian vehicles. After the Russians panic and start looking for cover, the Bashtanka defenders ambush them, finishing up the vehicles in the tail of the column and capturing 28 Russian soldiers. On March 1st, in Bashtanka, local resistance lost only 4 members of the territorial defense, demonstrating that the battle for southern Ukraine is far from being over. On the left bank, the Russians advance along the river without resistance and concentrate their forces in the village of Dniprovka. However, upon trying to enter Enerhodar, the city where the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is located, they face civilians who block the road. Inside the city, the National Guard and Territorial Defense Forces also prepare for a fight in complete encirclement. The city of Tokmak is also first encircled and then quickly captured, as Ukrainian regular army units resist in a more or less organized manner only in Vasilievka. There, Ukrainians first fight back quite effectively on February 28th, blowing up BMP with Ruslan Gashiatulin, the battalion commander of the 19th Motor Rifle Division. On the night between March 1st and 2nd, the Russians undertake another attempt to enter Bashtanka, but territorial defense forces ambush them in the area of the village of Dobre, forcing the column to retreat. On the same day, the defenders of Bashtanka destroyed the Russian Panzer S air defense system, likely deployed at the spearhead of the attack due to the active work of Ukrainian Su-25s. Once again, the local police provide significant assistance, here as well as inside Mykolaiv, forming a separate Khazak unit, focused on fighting the invaders rather than performing regular duties. The Russians, still unable to take Bashtanka, where Ukrainians resist doggedly, maintain some control over the city perimeter, but fail to take the foothold inside. They also led operatives from the 10th Spetsnaz Brigade in Balovne from helicopters, but Ukrainians immediately engage, tying the elite Russian troops in heavy combat. Meeting stiff resistance of the main advance axis, the Russians make a bold maneuver, rushing dozens of vehicles between Mykolaiv and Bashtanka. It soon becomes clear that their target is the city of Voznesensk. It hosts one of the key Ukrainian air bases and, most importantly, a bridge across the sizable Pivdenny Bug river. The Russians must cross it to reach three main goals in the southern Ukraine. First, to encircle and capture the large city of Mykolaiv, then envelop the even larger key city of Odessa and land the Marines there, and finally to push to the border with Transnistria, a separatist enclave in the Moldova with close ties to Russia. The invading force begins to advance to Voznesensk with separate columns from three directions, from Troitske, Novosafronivka, and Yelenets. Beside the local territorial defense battalion, Voznesensk is reinforced with battered but still quite capable elements of the 80th Air Assault Brigade as well as fresher 28th Mechanized Brigade that starts arriving at the front line. Here, the time bought by Antonivka bridge defenders is not wasted, as the city is prepared for urban combat and all the bridges are properly mined. The Russians quickly roll into the southern part of the city, expecting no resistance, but they are hit by Ukrainian artillery and attacked from all sides by city defenders. The 11th Engineering Brigade happens to be in the spearhead of the attack, likely with the task of building pontoon bridges across Pivdenny Bug, but they quickly fold in a heavy combat. Reinforced by the 126th Coastal Defense Brigade, however, the Russians are still capable of inflicting high losses on the city defenders. Eventually, the Ukrainians blow up the key bridge that splits the town as well as a railroad bridge across Pivdenny Bug, locking Russian forces in one of the city districts. The Russians fail to quickly understand that this route of advance is the dead end now and simply enter and withdraw from the city district multiple times, apparently looking for ways to continue their advance. Under the fire of Ukrainian artillery, they also cannot build pontoon bridges to cross the Pivdenny Bug, and the column begins to spill into nearby towns, losing direction. This is a turning point in the entire Russian southern campaign, as despite their impressive advance, the Russians bog down. Stiff resistance in Mykolaiv, Bashtanka and Voznesensk breaks the momentum that used to be the Russians' main advantage, and from now on, the invading force slowly starts suffering from overextension and overall losses. In heavy battles and ambushes of the Russian troops, Mikhail Yermonin, the commander of the Rocket Artillery Battalion of the 126th Brigade, is killed, which further highlights the fact that Russians continue to attack with odd, to say the least, composition of forces. On March 3rd, Ukrainian artillery ramps up strikes using information relayed by locals. The combined force of the 28th and 80th Brigades, along with territorial defense units, begin counterattack that pushes the 11th and 126th Brigades out of the only contested city district. The Russians, who have just brought their own artillery closer and started shelling the city, do not expect such swift counterattack, especially as the defenders of Voznesensk hardly have any armored vehicles. Instead, the bulk of Ukrainian forces consists of infantry, with javelins representing the heaviest of their weapons. Though this does not stop them from advancing quickly, using their knowledge of terrain to enter heavy combat with armor. Under the onslaught, Russian morale collapses as losses mount. In a matter of hours, the remnants of the Russian forces are completely routed, and most of their equipment is either destroyed or captured, signifying the first major victory for Ukrainian forces in the area. Now, it's clear that Ukrainians bounce back after the initial catastrophic retreat and are determined to regain the initiative. But this is just the beginning. In the next part we will uncover how defenders of Mykolaiv held their ground through relentless assaults, why Chernobivka airport became a symbol of resistance, and how each battle brought Ukraine one step closer to the future liberation of Kherson.